Hello, everyone, and welcome to our weekly virtual chai chat. My name is Dania. I work at the American Center Tashkent, and today I'm joined by an American diplomat, Russell Singer. Hello, Russell. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let me introduce you to our audience. Russell Singer has worked as a Foreign Service Officer in the U.S. State Department since 2004 and has served in Honduras, Russia, Germany, and Uzbekistan, as well as at the United Nations as a negotiator on issues related to sustainable development in the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council. He currently works at the U.S. Embassy in Tashkent as the head of the International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Section, overseeing U.S. foreign assistance related to counter narcotics and law enforcement reforms. And before we get started, I want to thank everyone who has joined us today and remind that we want to hear from you. So if you have any questions on today's topic, please put them in the comment sections, both on Facebook and YouTube, and we will address them to our presenter. All right. Thanks again, Russell. Let's get it started. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Dania. And very nice to, I wish I could see you all. Unfortunately, we can't do this in person, but I hope everybody is staying safe and healthy. And it's my pleasure to provide this presentation. And please, as was said, please ask any questions that you have. I'm happy to answer. So I served at the UN in 2014 to 2017, which was a very, very busy time due to a lot of different negotiations that were going on, many of which were related to sustainable development. So that's the topic of my talk today. This picture here is a picture of me addressing the General Assembly, which I was lucky enough to do only once, to address the whole General Assembly, as most of the meetings tend to take place in smaller venues. So I thought I would just start by talking a little bit about, the background of the General Assembly. As most people know, the UN has two main bodies, the Security Council and the General Assembly. Sometimes the Security Council is the one that's a little bit more in the news because it deals with things like war and crises, and so it tends to get a little bit more attention. But the General Assembly is actually, in my view, and I think in many people's view, the most important part of the UN. And the reason why is because it's the place where every country has a vote. The Security Council obviously is limited to only 5 permanent members and 10 temporary members. But every country in the world has a seat in the General Assembly. And according to the UN Charter, it's the General Assembly that's supposed to be the main policy-making body of the UN. And its main job is to set global norms and contribute to international law and express the political will of the member states. Another job that it has is, of course, to handle the UN budget, which for 2018 to 19 was roughly $5.5 billion. The topics that the General Assembly deals with are generally divided into these 3 pillars. Peace and security is the first one, human rights is the second one, and the last one is sustainable development. And there's a little star next to sustainable development, and that's generally because it had been widely thought that before, I would say before the last 10 years, sustainable development was not really getting as much attention as the other 2 pillars. I think that's definitely changed a little bit in the recent couple of years. So what is so unique about the General Assembly? The first thing is that unlike the Security Council, developing countries in the General Assembly have a majority, and they often set the agenda. So some of the larger developed countries like the United States or the European countries, they don't have the ability to block the will of the majority of states. And that's, gives it a much different character than the kind of negotiations you see in the Security Council, where the 5 permanent members are able to block anything they don't like. The second major thing is that because there's so many members of the General Assembly, negotiations in the General Assembly tend to be take a lot more time. And that means that the General Assembly doesn't really, is not very effective in dealing with crises. It's much more focused on longer term issues. The Security Council deals with threats to international peace. And so that's really the place where you see crises dealt with. But the General Assembly is much more focused on these longer term issues. The third thing that's important is that many countries rely on the General Assembly for technical assistance and guidance. Many smaller countries don't have the resources to develop the kind of technical guidance they might need. And they don't need to because of the fact that the General Assembly is able to share best practices and international standards. The last item I put on there is just that there is, of course, a little bit, particularly in the United States, but maybe in other countries as well, there is some historic sensitivity about the General Assembly serving as some kind of world government that could override the will of individual countries. So that's something that's always an issue that's present when we talk about the General Assembly. So this slide, I wanted to point out the history of sustainable development as it's discussed at the UN. So the first real big UN event related to sustainable development was way back in 1992, what was called the Rio Earth Summit. There had been earlier meetings, of course, but this was the most important one in recent history. That was followed in 2000 by the adoption of what was called the Millennium Development Goals, or the MDGs. The MDGs, though, were adopted by the Secretary General. They were not actually negotiated by the member states. And that was one of the big problems with the MDGs, is that many countries didn't really feel ownership of those goals. In 2002, there was a conference on financing for development because it was realized that it's very difficult to achieve any of these sustainable development issues if you don't actually talk about how you're going to pay for it. And so that became also a very important topic for discussion. In 2012, there was a summit meeting to follow up on the original Earth Summit because it was 20 years had gone by. And at that meeting, there was an agreement among the member states to start negotiating what we now know as the Sustainable Development Goals. And these were seen as successors to the Millennium Development Goals, but they were seen as much more legitimate because they would be negotiated by all of the member states. So that negotiating process started, and it ended in 2015 when there was the largest gathering of world leaders in history who came to the UN to adopt what's called the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And I was very lucky to be there at that time and to serve on the US negotiating team for the SDGs and the 2030 Agenda. Definitely one of the highlights of my career so far, but also a very challenging experience. This slide, I'm just trying to show why 2015 was such an important year. There was actually 5 summits that happened that year, all of which involved an incredible amount of work and led up to these sort of agreements on sustainable development. So the first was this idea, the Sendai framework. This was a meeting in Japan that discussed disaster risk reduction. So basically, how can countries better prepare for disasters, natural disasters or other types of disasters? The second was another meeting on financing for development. This was a follow-on to that earlier meeting that I had talked about previously. And this resulted in an outcome that was called the Addis Ababa Action Agenda. The meeting took place in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. And then, of course, the third one was the adoption of the SDGs at the UN, which I just mentioned. And then following the adoption of the SDGs, there was a meeting called Habitat 3 in Ecuador, which adopted an outcome called the New Urban Agenda. And this New Urban Agenda was an agreement that talked about how to deal with sustainable development in the context of cities, right? Which is a huge issue because, as we know now, the vast majority of human population lives in cities, at least in most countries in the world. And so cities are sort of seen as the battleground or the center of the efforts that we need to make in order to improve sustainable development and overcome some of our the environmental challenges we face. The last agreement, which I put in parentheses, was of course the Paris Agreement on Climate Change. The reason why that's in parentheses is because that was not negotiated by the UN General Assembly. The Paris Agreement on Climate Change is negotiated by a different group that's called the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. That is a little bit of a separate process from the other 4 documents which were negotiated by the General Assembly and the member states. But of course, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change was a hugely important document and a hugely important summit because obviously climate change is one of the essential elements of the battle for sustainable development. On this slide, I'm just showing a few examples of what I already mentioned about this issue of cities. So at the bottom, you can see that there are 2 slides related to headlines from newspapers about the role that cities play. The first one is talking about how cities how climate change will be solved in cities. And the second one is talking about the refugee crisis, which is again a city crisis, right? So another example of a huge international crisis, which was having a huge impact on cities. So all of those slides I've shown and what I've talked about so far was very theoretical. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the reality of what it's like to negotiate at the UN, because sometimes the reality is a lot different than the theory. So when there's a negotiation at the UN, the first thing that happens is co-facilitators are appointed. The co-facilitators are individuals, people who are one from the developed countries and one from the developing countries. And they are just people like myself who work at the UN, who are delegates at the UN. And they come together and it's their job to manage the process of how a negotiation works. Negotiations tend to have these 3 stages. It sort of has a very unique rhythm how these negotiations work. The beginning of a negotiation is very ceremonial. Countries give these very grand statements about what their big goals, and it's a lot of very lofty language. The middle of the negotiation is when you start to get down to the details. Countries begin to highlight what their key priorities are, and hopefully, if you're lucky, there's some agreement on issues that are not controversial. The final stage is, of course, the most difficult, and that's when you isolate all of the topics that are very, very controversial, where there's no agreement, and where you need to do the most work to sort of overcome conflicts. And unfortunately, that's obviously the stage that takes up the most amount of time. Now, negotiations at the UN happen in this very different style of meetings. So I've listed the names of them. It's obviously a very, very funny names. The first are formal meetings. So a formal meeting of the General Assembly is the kind of meeting you see, on TV or something, where all of the representatives are in the big General Assembly hall. They're sitting behind the name of their country. They're called out, to speak from the podium. They use their microphones and so on. No real negotiations happen in formals. These are generally just the opening ceremonies or special events, things like that. Informals are the next level in which countries give opening statements. They're often not in the General Assembly Hall. They're in some of the other assembly halls. Most countries do participate, and countries do sit behind their name but often the countries can sit anywhere in the hall. So it's not, countries aren't lined up in their formal order the way they would be in a formal meeting. The speaking order is also much more informal. People can raise their hands or be called on in different orders. Now, informal informals are really the heart and soul of negotiating at the UN, and that's where 95% of the work gets done. An informal informal is called by the co-facilitators. It doesn't meet in any of the big meeting halls. It usually meets in a smaller room. There are usually about 30 to 40 people, sometimes less, maybe 20 to 30, who show up for informal informals. And it's a much more informal atmosphere. The meetings are still run by the co-facilitators, but people can raise their hands, and there's often dialogue that goes back and forth. Questions get asked, and so forth. And that's really, again, like I said, the most important meetings. Okay, so the last one, informal, informal, informals, a very silly name, but these are used when the negotiations get to that final stage and there's an obstacle that just can't seem to be overcome. So the co-facilitators, if they feel like they need to call an informal, informal, they will do so. And what that means is they invite representatives from the different negotiating blocks, and I'll talk about what those blocks are in a minute, and they invite them to somewhere informal, like a cafe or a private office. And usually we're talking now about 4 or 5 people at the most. And there the co-facilitator basically lays out to them, this is the place where we have to either figure out if we're going to be able to reach agreement or not. And usually the countries or the blocks who come to that, that's where they have to be much more honest about what they can accept or what they can't accept, and give the co-facilitators some sense of how, whether it's possible to reach an agreement. Now, what is it that we're all negotiating, of course, is a document. The document is called an outcome document, and the facilitators are in charge of managing the process by which the outcome document is edited. How is it changed? So in the beginning of the negotiation, the co-facilitators will come up with the first draft, and weirdly, it's called the zero draft. The zero draft is just the starting point. It's the document that's put together by the co-facilitators. None of the countries have given their input yet or agreed to it at all. It's just the starting point for the negotiation. And the co-facilitators have the choice of either deciding to hold on to that, to be the ones who decide how that document gets edited, or they can do something that's called line-by-line negotiating, which is where they let every country or every bloc suggest changes to the document. So those two styles of negotiating are a little different. I won't get into the details, but they can really affect how the negotiations go. Another important thing is this idea of multi-stakeholders. So the UN organization is really, the UN General Assembly is really just made up of member states when you get down to negotiations. But there's a whole group of organizations who want to influence these outcome documents, right? And those include UN agencies. They include groups that represent other organizations, international organizations, all kinds of NGOs, the media. There's all kinds of other organizations that are interested in influencing these outcome documents. Their only real mechanism for influencing these outcome documents is either to speak at the formals or informal meetings. So they are invited to the formals or the informal meetings. They're not invited to informal informals, and they are certainly not invited to informal informals. So a lot of times what they have to do is try to speak to the UN delegates who are representing the member states privately. And that's a lot of what they do at the UN. They try to find the delegates and see if they can convince them to take up some of their positions in these negotiations. Now, I mentioned that a lot of the negotiations happens in blocks. There's three main blocks of countries. The first is called the Group of 77. It's a group of 70. When it was founded, it was a group of 77 developing countries. It's expanded now to this point where it includes 134 countries. And I believe Uzbekistan is a member. I'm relatively certain. I'm not 100% sure, but so the G77, as it's called, represents the developing countries, and it was formed out of an understanding that the developing countries needed to group together in order to have as much influence as some of the developed countries, like the European Union or the U.S. and some of the other Western states. And that was really done as a way to try and enhance the power of these developing countries in negotiations, because the developing countries realized that if they negotiated singly as single individual countries, they wouldn't really have as much influence as they would if they negotiated as a bloc. The European Union, of course, now made up of 27 member states, is also a bloc that negotiates as one. So they coordinate internally before they ever come to a negotiation. And when they come to a negotiation, they speak as one voice. So if you're a member of the European Union, you have basically two levels to negotiate. The first is within the EU, and then the EU reaches a common position. And then someone from the EU brings that common position to the negotiations at the UN and represents the EU member states at the UN. And then finally, the last group has a funny name. It's called JUSCANS, which is an acronym representing Japan, US, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And basically, this is made up of almost all of the member states that don't belong to the first two groups. JUSCANS is not a formal bloc, so these countries don't negotiate as one group. They all negotiate separately, but they definitely share information. They often have common positions, and they often back each other up during negotiations. There are countries that are members of JUSCANS that are not listed here. These are just the main members, but there are a few others. Iceland, Norway, I think Turkey is a member. There's quite a few. So I thought it would be important to talk about some of the key fights that tend to happen at the UN during negotiations. So this is a list of the main topics. I won't go through all of them in detail, but I've tried to capture with the cartoons on the right the fact that, unfortunately, at the UN, a lot of the negotiations and discussions are really difficult conversations between developed and developing countries. And some of the main reasons for that include this idea that I've listed at the top called common but differentiated responsibilities, right? So you can imagine if we're talking about an issue like pollution or climate change, many of the developing countries say, well, a lot of the pollution or the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was caused by the developed countries. Why is it now their responsibility as developing countries to do as much work as the developed countries in seeking to address, fix this problem? Of course, the developing countries also say that, they don't have as much resources as some of the more wealthy countries. And so that's kind of this very big issue that is continually coming up. Do all of the member states have to take the same type of actions when some of the countries don't have the resources? Should the developed countries pay more? So on and so forth. Means of implementation and technology transfer are both also part of that argument. Means of implementation is a fancy way of saying, how are you going to pay for all of these policies that the UN is saying countries should adopt, right? So, for example, when the UN adopted the Sustainable Development Goals, obviously, for a country to implement all of the new policies that would be needed to implement the SDGs would require a lot of money. And so how are developing countries supposed to come up with those kind of funds to support that? That's what's meant by means of implementation. And same with technology transfer. The developing countries often say that the developed countries should transfer technology to help them address some of these issues. In terms of the other issues, foreign occupation is a fancy way of referring to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. That's a conflict that somehow manages to work its way into every negotiation at the United Nations, which often, even though the topic of the negotiation may have nothing to do with that issue, and as you can imagine, it often complicates things. Binding and non-binding refers to this idea of whether things that get adopted there are binding in the sense that governments are required to do whatever the policy is, or whether they are just basically suggestions. The UN budget is a huge issue, and the reason for that is that contributions to the UN budget are based on a country's GDP. So as you can imagine, the United States is the largest contributor to the UN budget. When I was there, it paid roughly 22 or 23% of the entire UN budget. Smaller developing countries obviously have smaller GDPs, and their share of the UN budget is much, much smaller. But of course, in the General Assembly, every country has the same vote. And so when the General Assembly passes policies that require an increase in the UN budget, the countries that pay less to the budget tend to be more willing to do that, whereas the countries that pay more in the UN budget, like the United States, tend to be very opposed to anything that increases the budget. And you can imagine that's a difficult conversation. Climate change, of course, is also a very, very challenging discussion for many, many reasons. Again, related to the issue I've already talked about, but also, if you're a small island nation in the Pacific, you can imagine that's difficult. If you're a country like Saudi Arabia or others that rely on oil, you can imagine their attitude towards climate change is different. So there's just so many different elements to the conversation on climate change that it often makes things very, very challenging. So in conclusion, the keys to success about how to succeed in negotiating. The first thing is really important to understand how negotiations work. And by that, I mean the things I've talked about, the different stages of a negotiation, the different types of a meeting, different levels of a meeting, the role of the co-facilitators. All of those things are so important if you want to be effective in getting your country's point of view into the final document. And oftentimes, I saw very clearly that the success of a country had almost nothing to do with the size of that country or the influence or power of that country. It had a lot more to do with the ability of their delegate to understand how negotiations really work. And there were a few people who were there when I was there who were just incredibly impressive, and they were consistently able to be successful in getting their own country's viewpoint into these final outcome documents. Some of the other issues, obviously, the more member states you can convince of your point of view is going to help. And your relationship with the co-facilitators is very important. Institutional support, there I'm referring to the UN Secretariat, because the UN Secretariat is the organization that actually does all of the organizational aspects of the negotiating. By that, I mean they provide the background information, they provide budget information, they provide all kinds of things that have influence on how the negotiations go. These pictures at the bottom of the screen here are showing the actual outcome documents from those 4 UN General Assembly negotiations in 2015. all of them related to different aspects of sustainable development. This second slide on conclusions is a little bit less about how to succeed and a little bit more about some of the challenges that negotiations at the UN face. The first is unfortunate, but I think a true reality, and that is that a lot of the negotiations at the UN don't really deal with the substance of the technical question, but rather much more commonly deal with these very big geopolitical disagreements, right? Oftentimes between the developed and developing countries, sometimes between other countries, but often these negotiations at the UN get used as a way of talking about those geopolitical agreements rather than focusing on the substance. The second thing is that the outcome documents from these negotiations are really an expression of political will. They're not usually very helpful in terms of being actual technical guidance, because the people who are doing the negotiations, like myself, are not technical experts. They're really just representing the political will of their governments. Ideally, the technical experts in our own governments are helping us and providing us with guidance, and that's in the best case scenario, which was often the case. But again, the outcome document is an expression of the political will of the country, of the governments of the world, rather than a document produced by technical experts, right? These outcome documents are hugely helpful in setting global priorities and helping technical experts to raise money. That's really the value of these outcome documents. If you can get the General Assembly to put out a statement about an important topic, that's going to certainly help you when you go back to your member state government and say, we need money to implement the Sustainable Development Goals, for example. The next issue is this idea of gridlock versus legitimacy. Gridlock, I mean, if countries are so set on their positions that they can't reach agreement, that's going to make the UN less effective. If the UN is incapable of reaching an agreement, then the UN is not able to say anything, right? So there's this weird tension between legitimacy and effectiveness, right? If you don't have legitimacy, it makes it very hard to be effective. The UN is the most legitimate organization in the world in terms of representing member states because every member state has a vote. But sometimes when the outcome document is too focused on these geopolitical disagreements and there's not enough substance in the outcome documents, it undermines the value and effectiveness of those outcome documents. And then this last issue, if you look at the past, maybe 50 years ago, in the international system, the only thing that really mattered were the member states. That was the only important, they were the only important players in the international system. But now, in today's age, there are vastly more important, not more important, but vastly more number of players in the international stage. And that includes non-governmental organizations, that includes corporations, that includes cities, includes all kinds of different actors who play hugely important roles in the international system. And the UN system hasn't really evolved in a way to really adopt to that new reality. So that's a big issue that's facing the UN right now. So this last slide kind of gets at some of these big questions about the UN. When you work there, you sort of can't avoid thinking about these things. The first is, is there actually any impact from these documents that we negotiate at the UN? Or do they just kind of get put on the shelf somewhere? That's a real challenging question. Many countries negotiate at the UN, but tend to ignore any outcomes that come from the UN, because when they go back to their own country, of course, the actors that set policy within a country are national actors, right? The parliament, the president, the court system, so on. So there's this question of how much influence do these international negotiations have uh, in fighting the climate change crisis, in fighting the refugee, in managing the refugee crisis, and so on? Or is it just the actions of individual member states that are more important? And then the last thing is this issue that I mentioned at the end of the last slide. All of these actors who are now playing very important roles in the international community, how is the UN going to adopt to this new reality? They really haven't, I think, done a very good job so far. And this is something that's a big question going forward. So that's the last slide I have. I'll end here and happy to answer any questions. Please feel free, if anything I said wasn't clear, to ask for clarification.
Thank you so much, Russell. It was really interesting and informative. We have one question from Munisa Abdukarimova. Let me put it on the screen. What is included in Sustainable Development Goals?
Okay. So that was a great issue when they decided to negotiate the SDGs. There were a lot of issues that got put on the table and asked, whether they should be included. So there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. I'm not going to list them all here. You can certainly look online and you can find that list. The number one sustainable, the first sustainable goal is probably the most important, and that is ending poverty. There are other important goals that are on issues like improving health, education, work. There's a goal on energy. There's a goal on cities. There's a goal on just and peaceful societies, basically related to governance issues. There's all kinds of different goals that got included. There's a goal on climate change. So you can imagine all of these different things got included. I should say, though, sustainable development goals, sustainable development in general is founded on 3 pillars. Those 3 pillars are economic, environmental, and social issues. The member states agreed on that when they defined sustainable development back at the Rio summit. The issue that got left out, of course, is the political pillar. And of course, that's very controversial for member states to agree on, because you have obviously many different types of member states with many different forms of government. And so that was just seen as far too controversial. But anyway, so like I said, the Sustainable Development Goals, there's 17 of them. You can find them all online if you're interested in the details. They are very detailed. They go into quite specific detail about not, what actually the goals are. So each goal has very clear objectives. So the goal on poverty is to end poverty. The goal on renewable energy has very concrete targets on increasing renewable energy. All of the goals have objectives under them with very concrete, specific targets that are meant to be achieved by 2030, right? So it was a 15-year project. Could all these goals be achieved by 2030? And the member states have committed to undertake policies to work towards achieving those goals.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Munisa, for your question. Next question from Gulshan Mahmudova. Thank you for this interesting presentation. Are there any particular topics that usually take longer to reach agreement during the negotiations?
Yeah, so absolutely. I had that whole slide that I showed of the most difficult conversations. Common but differentiated responsibilities, which we call CBDR for short. That is by far the most difficult, always takes a long time. Foreign occupation, the issue of Palestine and Israel, always takes by far a huge amount of time. Climate change is again another huge issue, largely over the idea of who's going to pay, who's going to pay for the policies that we need to implement, to manage climate change. Who's means of implementation and technology transfer, also a huge problem. Who's going to pay for all these sustainable development policies? Those are, I think, the big ones that consistently take up the most amount of time.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I want to remind everyone that as we are still live, please put your questions in the comments and our speaker will answer them. As you mentioned about funding, I want to ask who usually funds all these meetings?
Yeah, so the UN budget includes, supports all of these meetings, right? So $5.5 billion is a huge amount of money. But the UN has a calendar of events, right? So you're probably all familiar with the opening of the General Assembly, which happens every September. The General Assembly generally meets from September to December, where there's a very intense amount of activity. That's when every year, many of the things I've talked about were outcome documents for large summits where leaders of countries come together. But every year, the General Assembly negotiates updates to a whole list of resolutions. And that all happens between September and December. That's the busiest time of year. But then there's also the Economic and Social Council, which meets a couple of different other times during the year. In June or July, I think there's a meeting of what's called the High Level Political Forum, which is where they do monitoring and evaluation of the Sustainable Development Goals. But all of these events are on the UN's calendar, and the support and the logistics and the interpretation and the reports that get printed, all of that comes out of the UN budget. And so anytime the member states want to create a new meeting, that, as you can imagine, that causes a huge negotiation because nobody wants to increase the budget. But unfortunately, every meeting requires money in order to hold. And so if there is a desire to have a new meeting, there has to be, again, a negotiation about whether the member states are willing to pay. And that I would definitely add that to the list. The negotiations about the UN budget are very difficult. I personally never had to. We have specialists who handle the budget negotiations, and I'm very glad that I never personally had to do that.
Thank you. Another question from Firuz Karimov. What is your advice and recommendations for young negotiators in terms of negotiation training?
Yeah. So that's a great question. That's very important. The most important thing is to be professional. Everybody who's negotiating at the UN is representing their country's point of view. Your personal point of view is completely irrelevant, and you have to make sure that you convey your opinions in a very professional manner, right? You don't ever want to insult anyone. You want to show respect for everybody else who's negotiating, right? That's the most important thing. The second thing I would say that's important is that the key to success in negotiating, I mentioned one already, understanding the process, right? Make sure you understand the process. The third, I think, and final element is personal relationships. The people who are the most successful at negotiating know all the other negotiators and get to know them well, right? So, for example, when I was negotiating at the UN, every week I would have breakfast with a colleague of mine who negotiated for the G77, right? And it wasn't because we were sharing secrets or anything. We were building a personal relationship so that when we got to that final stage of the negotiation and we needed to find a way to overcome a difficult obstacle, we were at least friends, and we could at least trust each other and be honest with each other about whether there was a chance to reach an agreement. And that was really important. So the better relationships you have with negotiators, the much more gives you a much bigger ability to be effective in negotiating, particularly with the co-facilitators, but definitely with the negotiators from the opposing, from the other blocks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Another question came from Firuz. He's asking, in many cases, greater powers usually try to pursue their own agenda. What do you think about it?
So, to be frankly honest, every country at the UN is trying to pursue its own agenda, right? That's the name of the game. That's the whole reason why they're all there. So that's I think completely accepted by everybody, right? It's understood that every country is there trying to pursue their own agenda. Now, probably what you're getting at is the fact that the larger countries have a lot more influence, maybe because they have more money and more ability to more resources to support their negotiators, and that's absolutely true. But again, as I said, at the General Assembly, the developing countries by far have the majority, right? There's 134 developing countries. If you look at the EU member states, there's only 28. If you look at the member of JUSCANS, there's only, I don't remember offhand, but maybe 15, right? So the the influence that the wealthier, more powerful countries have is certainly balanced by number, the quantity of developing countries. And so that's what makes negotiating at the General Assembly so interesting. It's not like the Security Council, where the big countries can just use their veto and pretty much ignore other, if they want, ignore what smaller countries think. It's really not possible in the General Assembly for larger countries to ignore what the smaller countries think, because the smaller countries have the majority. So in that way, it's a good balance between influence and numbers.
Thank you, and thank you, Firuz, for your questions. So, Russell, can you tell the process before the negotiations? So, what usually happens? Do UN members visit developing countries and do their own research on issues? Can you tell us about that?
Sure. So that depends on whether we're talking about the outcome document from a UN summit or whether we're just talking about one of these annual General Assembly resolutions. So for the annual General Assembly resolutions, those are very small. We don't have the resources or the time for that kind of background. So there's really the only thing that goes into those resolutions is all of the technical expertise in our headquarters contribute their expertise. So, for example, when we start a negotiation, we will get that zero draft from the co-facilitators. I will go back to the U.S. government, to the State Department, and I will share that draft. And somebody in the State Department is responsible for reaching out to all of the technical experts in the U.S. government who might have any input into that topic. And they're responsible for putting together the information that's going to help me to do the negotiation. I don't come up with the U.S. negotiating stance. I'm just the negotiator. I'm just reflecting whatever the technical experts back in my government are telling me, right? Now, for a huge summit like the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development or the Habitat 3 meeting, that is a much bigger process. So usually what happens then is there are preparatory meetings where countries come together, and they happen in different countries. So we had, I think, 3 preparatory meetings before we had the summit for Habitat 3. And at those meetings, we invite technical experts who come and speak, both from the private sector, but also from specific countries' governments who might have some specific expertise. And those preparatory events allow us to start to get a sense of what the most important issues are, where we need to focus our attention, and that's really important to make sure that when we get to the actual negotiation, we have all of the technical background information we need to make sure we're talking about the right issues.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And you mentioned that the challenging part is the agreement. So how long usually it takes to end up with that agreement?
Yeah, so I can tell you some horror stories, honestly. So I was a member of the SDGs. The final agreement, I think, lasted. So this is just the final agreement. The whole negotiation from start to finish took, years, right? There were multiple meetings, multiple sessions. They started negotiating, I don't even remember if it was 2013 or 12, but they didn't finish until 2015. At the final negotiating session, where we got down to the final big obstacles, the actual negotiating session itself, I think, lasted 2.5 days with no breaks, right? No breaks for food, no breaks for showers, no breaks for anything, right? Of course, we had people bringing us food because we needed to eat. But these negotiating sessions go round the clock. And that wasn't the worst one. The negotiations for Habitat 3 about cities, the final negotiation lasted for 3 full days, 72 hours. We were locked in a room for 72 hours. And as you can imagine, at the end of 72 hours, we were all exhausted. I actually missed my daughter's birthday party, which was a little sad. But but anyway, so yeah, so the actual negotiating sessions, particularly at the end, can be quite grueling. The ones at the beginning are very, very polite and they always end on time, and they're not difficult at all. It's only when you get to these end stages where you need to finish, that's where you get these very difficult, long sessions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And let's talk about some positive part. What type of the meetings during these negotiations is your favorite ones and why?
Oof, that's a good question. I mean, I have to be honest, the UN, so the UN, the diplomats who work at the UN are the smartest, most interesting people in the world. Because for every country around the world, for their foreign service, their diplomatic service, a posting to the UN is literally like the top job. It's the most important job. So they tend to send their best people. So the people who I met when I was working at the UN, regardless of whether we agreed on any of the things we were negotiating, were just fantastic. I mean, I just really enjoyed getting to know them, talking with them, maybe not negotiating with them, but but really developing personal relations with them. And that became important when we got down to the end of these negotiations. Those were sort of the best and worst parts of the negotiation because they were horrible because I was tired and hungry and cranky. But they were great because I was with people who I really admired. And in quite a few examples, we were able to do some incredible work and come up with some incredible compromises, right? When we got to the point where we put aside, our standard positions and we said, okay, we need to finish. How do we come up with a compromise that both sides can support? That's really a very creative process. And you can only do that with someone you really trust, right? And I was honored to have gotten to a level of trust with several people, many people from the G77, from the European Union, that we were able to do that on some of these very challenging and difficult negotiations. And those will always be highlights of my time in the Foreign Service, but for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I want to pull out Munisa's comment. Dear Russell Singer, thank you for your presentation. I didn't know about sustainable development goals and Uzbekistan's participation in such important actions. I have just read about it in UNDP website. Thank you, Munisa, for your comment. One question from Gulshan. Looks like negotiation may be tough. Why did you choose to become a negotiator at the UN General Assembly?
Yeah, so first let me just comment on the last comment. I would just say, the Sustainable Development Goals are hugely important. Just today, for example, as part of my role at the embassy, I was part of a consultation meeting with the government here in which they were talking about the Sustainable Development Goals and their plans to implement them. Right. So these goals are things that are now influencing policy in every country around the world. And so, that's really important. And I was really very grateful to be part of that process. In terms of the question, why did I choose to become a negotiator? Most assignments in the Foreign Service, we tend to work at what's called a bilateral mission, where we go to a country and we work in the embassy in that country, like I'm doing here in Uzbekistan. And then everything you do is about that one country, right? So everything I'm doing here is related to the U.S. relationship to Uzbekistan. And that's great and it's interesting, but the UN is such a different experience because every country in the world is there, right? And you're talking about these issues that have global importance and you're negotiating with people from all around the world. So I felt after having served in many different countries, the idea of going to the UN and talking about these really important issues with people from around the world was just something that was really, really fascinating. The second answer, probably maybe a little bit more honestly, is I'm from New York. So the chance to come home and to be in New York and to work at the UN, but also to be in New York was an opportunity I couldn't pass up.
Great, thank you. And Munisa continued commenting, saying it's like a directory for the competitiveness of the countries and safe world.
Well, I don't know about competitiveness. I mean, there's definitely an understanding that not all countries have the same resources or the same ability, right? That there's different levels of challenge. These SDGs represent a different level of challenge, and that's understood as part of the process. What I think is more unique is that this is the first time in history where all of the countries in the world have jointly committed to trying to achieve the same goals. That's never happened before in the history of the world. And so that I think is a really unique and special thing.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And I think that was the last comment. And it's actually 1 hour flew. That was really interesting. Thank you so much. I didn't know much about it, and I learned a lot from you. I want to thank all our viewers for watching, joining us today, and for your great questions and comments. And Russell, thanks again, and see everyone next Friday on our Chai Chat.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a
All right.
great one. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye.